In this video, I'm going to cover gross microbiological contamination. Here's an example of a microbiological test report that the lab provides. And take a look at it, and what you'll see is down at the bottom there, the 4 indicators. And you can see that on Pseudomonas aeruginosa, the level being indicated is 16 colony forming units per 100 millilitres of water. Now, based on the levels that we discussed in the last video, and I'll link to that video either down in the description or on the screen. But what we talked about in that last video is the fact that for example, if your Pseudomonas aeruginosa was above 10 colony forming units, which this is on this example that you're seeing now, if it's above 10 colony forming units, it's not acceptable. Now, you don't need to close the pool necessarily. You can keep the pool open, but what you'd need to do if you've got a sample, a report back from the lab like this, you'd need to do a retest. You'd need to look into what the problem is, and you'd certainly need to consider closing down if repeated tests reveal that you've got elevated levels of Pseudomonas aeruginosa above the levels that are acceptable that we discussed. But what if you get a report back from the lab with very highly elevated levels of bacteria? It can get to a point where it's regarded as being unacceptable straight away. So it's gone, the levels of bacteria have gone so high for some reason that you need to close the pool immediately. So you don't keep the pool open while you get a retest done. You close the pool and then you look into what the problem is. You still get a retest done, but you've got to close the pool, because what you've got at certain levels is something called gross microbiological contamination. Now, in the PUTAG book, they express gross microbiological contamination like this. Have a read of that, and what you might sort of appreciate is that it is a little bit difficult to sort of get your head around, really. What it says is that you've got gross microbiological contamination levels if you've got either of these two things. So the first one is greater than 10 E. coli per 100 ml in combination with an unsatisfactory colony count which is above 10 per ml, and or an unsatisfactory Pseudomonas aeruginosa count of greater than 10 per ml. Or the other point is if you've got greater than 50 Pseudomonas aeruginosa per 100 ml in combination with a high aerobic colony count of greater than 100 colony forming units per milliliter. So what we've created is a flowchart diagram to assist pool operators with the interpretation of microbiological test reports. So the way that it works is you start where it says start here. You've got your test report to hand, and you look at the first question, and it says, is E. coli greater than 10 colony forming units per 100 ml? And using this report as an example, what we can do is basically say, well, no, it isn't, because there's none detected. So you follow that arrow, and the next question it asks is Pseudomonas aeruginosa over 50 colony forming units per 100 ml? And it's 16 on the report, so you follow the no arrow and it takes you through to not gross microbiological contamination. Still not acceptable in terms of it does go beyond the limits that we talked about in the last video, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be closing the pool down, because even if the Pseudomonas aeruginosa was, for example, above 50 colony forming units, for it to be considered gross microbiological contamination, that would need to be in combination with an aerobic colony count at above 100 colony forming units per mil. But if your readings from the lab came back and you come to the conclusion that your levels, it's not just that they're not acceptable, that they've actually gone beyond just not acceptable and into gross microbiological contamination territory, what you need to do then is close the pool immediately, because it's dangerous. It's too heavily contaminated with bacteria. And what you do then is you investigate the reasons why there could be a problem and figure out what to do about it, and we'll cover that in another video.